Hey, art history, welcome back. We're going to look at photography and realism. These are kind of happening concurrently. They're a little bit different, clearly, but there's some influence back and forth happening. Photography is kind of an interesting application of technology to art. There was a lot of controversy about whether or not it should be an art or if it was just a scientific kind of invention. We basically have evidence that from the beginning, though, that it was being used as an art form. Photography began around the 1830s. There were two different people kind of creating the processes. There's probably plenty of more, but the two that we sort of focus on are Daguerre and Fox Talbot. Daguerre was a Frenchman who comes up with the daguerreotype, which is what you see here. This is his first daguerreotype. It's called Studio Still Life. So he borrows from the world of art by creating a still life, and he wants to drag some beautiful objects together and make a scene, and he's kind of framing it the way he wants. And so from early on, he establishes that a photographer can create a composition and can limit things and leave things in and leave things out and send a message and add color and light. All of that can be done in photography, which makes it a legit art form. Fox Talbot made something called the caliotype, which actually was a more sophisticated process. He copywrote his process so people couldn't copy it, whereas Daguerre never did, which is why the daguerreotype ends up taking off. So it also shows you about ownership and copyright law and all that kind of stuff can affect an art form. Very immediately, people start to see that you could use the art for journalistic purposes. These are from O'Sullivan and Gardner. There's also famous Matthew Brady. They all photographed the Civil War. This picture is called Harvest of Death, and it was a post-battle scene. The Civil War was one of the first photographed wars. And from that, they were able to they couldn't go during this, an actual fight scene, but they would go afterwards. And when they did that, they actually dragged the bodies and did a lot of kind of really unusual stuff and created compositions to give more of a feeling because they wanted people to understand how horrible the war was, but at home. And I'll just click through a couple photographs so you could see kind of the types of things that people were doing this with. So this is an early operation. They decided to photograph operations. This woman is under ether at Mass General Hospital in 1847. There's also portraiture comes up very fast. So that famous Liberty Leading the People by Delacroix. This is Delacroix. It was photographed by Nadar, another Frenchman, in 1855. So we actually get to see famous people photographed after this is made, which is changes the course of history in so many ways. And photographs were cheaper and easier to get their hands on. Not totally at first, but it was a little bit cheaper than going to someone very famous like Goya to do your painting. So that was something that made it more accessible. And this is actually a joke about Nadar by another artist that was sort of like a kind of a jab at him for kind of that photography was everywhere and he was getting all of Paris. Additionally, photography becomes an area that women have more accessibility to. So this is Julia Margaret Cameron. This is her own version of Ophelia, done in 1867, and she shows it with a little bit of light, shadow, props and whatnot, you could really create a very dramatic, beautiful picture. She becomes very famous for her photography and is one of kind of the founders of photography as an art form, as well as Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland. This is the Alice Little as a kid. They dressed up as like a ragamuffin, and this is the actual story that Alice in Wonderland, the girl that Alice in Wonderland was written about. This is what I wrote my senior thesis on, actually, in college. It's kind of been very interesting. There's some issues with it, and we could talk more about it another time if we want in discussion. Another Civil War photograph. And Muybridge looks at what happens. He really wanted to know is like when motion is happening, are things touching the ground? So he takes this collotype print where he ends up getting a horse galloping, and he sees indeed the horse actually has all feet in the air, and he does the same types of, he does people running, he does all sorts of different types of motion. So he's using that as a science, but when you put them all together, they're all a little bit different. And this could be easily compared to Warhol and whatnot. So it's actually kind of a cool photograph as well. So this all leads into realism, which is a reaction to romanticism, photography, and technological developments, interested in depicting the beauty of nature and the harshness of life. So instead of like the wildness of nature, it's more looking at kind of the man living amongst nature. And in France, it focused on the peasant classes living in the rural areas, the sublime of rural life. And in the United States, the majesty of the American landscape, all of that. This is one of the most famous of the realist painters. It's Gustave Courbet, excuse me, Gustave Courbet. It's called The Stonebreakers. It's from 1869. It has been destroyed in World War II. It was actually in a museum in Dresden, and it was bombed. So sadly, we do not have the real thing anymore. But if you notice, he's kind of breaking stone. He's battered and tattered. These two men would have never been, or this man and a boy would have never been shown in painting before. But he's kind of highlighting and celebrating their hard work, the kind of efforts they'll go through for really rudimentary, basic stuff that society needs. And it's very detailed. So you'll see there's tools kind of everywhere, and the grasses. He's really gone in detailed in a variety of ways to kind of make it feel more real. And here he has his a burial in 1849. And this one also kind of shows grief and mourning in a way that may make us think it's romantic, but he's actually celebrating kind of the common man. And he's sort of kind of doing a commentary of the wealth of the church and whatnot compared to the common Frenchman who is being buried straight into the ground like this. Here's my first personal favorite of the realists, Millet and the Gleaners. These are women that are picking the leftover product in a field. So this is, they're not getting the nice stuff, the nice hay, they're gleaning the stuff that nobody else would take. So it's the poorest of the poor that he's really focusing in on here. They're low and doing back-breaking work, you can see, and as well as wearing kind of very rudimentary clothing, very different from the stuff we saw in Goya's romantic picture of King Charles. And there's really nothing here, but still there's a beauty about it. There's light coming in. It's very soft here. I want you to look at these haystacks because actually these become major influences for Monet later. Monet did not come from nowhere. In fact, he was very influenced by some previous schools of art, and this celebration of the countryside was actually a very big Monet feeling. Next, we have Daumier. He's actually the guy who made the cartoon of Nadar and the air balloon. You can see an extreme situation here where you have this is extreme foreshortening with the legs. But as you look closer and closer, there's a child under him, someone's deceased here, there's a foreshortening in the leg here. So you come in looking at this awkward man, some people originally think he's asleep, there's a bed there, but when you come in, you see that this is actually a site of a murder. And that is a much kind of more dramatic thing than you would see in romanticism, because this isn't the fear of something, this is the reality of something, the reality of the life. On the street that they live on. It's actually called Rue Transonion, which is Rue is a street. So it's a street in Paris that's rough living. He also did this very famous oil on canvas. It always looks like pastel to me, but it's actually oil on canvas. It's a third class carriage in 1862. So it's not the first class, it's not the second class. These are the people that are, don't have a lot. And you can see kind of from the tiredness of their bodies. He dramatizes the feeling by making it kind of very dark here, and then in the lights he highlights with this strong bold line, which is a kind of new technique that people wouldn't have done before, because this doesn't look realistic in the way that we want naturalism, right? So this isn't natural, this isn't exactly it, but realism isn't about being perfectly real. It's about giving the feeling of the real and sort of the kind of the bringing attention to the everyday versus the very wealthy people. Notice during this period we start to have a distinction in hats, so that hats always tell us a story, as well as clothing tells us a story about people's class during this period, when these people are very exhausted and they look like they've had a long, hard day. You guys have seen this one before from the summer reading. So the horse fair, look at these horses. She talks a lot about their musculature. And it's just important because it's also Rosa Bonheur, who did a lot of horse stuff, but she was a famous woman artist, which was becoming more and more popular and possible at this period, which is kind of cool. And one of the most important artists here is Edward Manet, not Monet, Manet. He becomes before them. Sometimes he's placed with the Impressionists, so we actually will go back and look at Manet when we talk about the Impressionists again, because they saw his work and they were like, we want to do more of that. And part of the reason is that Manet did not finish his backgrounds. If you look back here and back here, it's all hazy. This is the beginning of what the Impressionists thought, let's try this out more. And he does that, he makes it unfinished in the back so that you'll hyper-focused on this super finished nude. She is completely covered by dark kind of foliage and stuff, and their dark clothing, so that you are even more aware of her nudity. In fact, some people would say that she's not nude, she is naked. And the reason is that nakedness is the concept that you know someone is looking at you, and that you're just doing it to kind of flaunt it, whereas nude is supposed to be artistic. And here she is, all the people around her are clothed, like hello, and she's sitting there naked and she's looking straight at the viewer. So we know, she knows. It's a back and forth. This completely scandalized all of Paris. They were incredibly upset by this painting. It's at the Musée d'Orsay now. You can go see it. It's quite beautiful. But it upset people because she knew she was naked, she was looking at you, and they actually all knew her. She was a well-known woman in Paris who was sort of like a high-class date, if you know what I mean. And back here also we have a little form to the classical. She's kind of bringing those old kind of classical pictures of like goddesses in the woods and all of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot going on in here. This kind of, oh, this spilled basket is what makes Cézanne make his paintings later. So we'll talk about that later. More Manet again later. I just wanted to show him with the realist because he was a realist. Here's Winslow Homer, a very famous American who did kind of the quietness of American life. He uses a lot of blues and yellows, and it kind of creates a very kind of silent feeling in them, but you see that there's this action of all of the hay around him in such a beautiful way. There's also The Gross Clinic by Thomas Eakins. This is actually the guy who Gross is made of. And he used to do open clinics for people to see surgeries and stuff. So they would paint him and stuff. That was kind of cool. This is John Singer Sargent. He sort of is this blend between realism and impressionism. But he sticks to the more real. And these are supposed to be the phases of these girls in childhood going to adulthood. He did a lot of upper class Gilded Age paintings of very famous families. That's who his patrons were, and he became very celebrated for that. If you want to know, there's a female counterpart during this time, which I forgot to put a photo in the slide, named Cecilia Beaux, who also did a very similar style, and the two of them are quite equal in ability. And here is Henry Tanner, The Thankful Poor. So this is from 1894, oil on canvas. Critics sort of go back and forth on Tanner. This painting, it was made to celebrate African-American life in a time that was incredibly difficult. This is after the fall of Reconstruction and then the rise of things of like the Klan and whatnot. And Tanner makes all of these very intimate portraits of family together in a quite beautiful way, and to kind of show the intimacy of Black life. But some people look back on it, and because it's a focus on the poor, that kind of frustrates people. But it was the time, and it was Tanner's kind of the world he lived in. And then here's Edomina Lewis and her Forever Free, which is a sculpture and done in 1867. It's actually at Howard University. It's 3 feet high, and it's just to show kind of the triumph over slavery in 1867. At that point, the war is over, and Americans